The gate went up on a Thursday, and by noon, I had become the most hated man in a 140-home neighborhood. Not because I yelled at anyone, not because I threatened anybody, and not because I caused some dramatic public scene. All I did was hang a steel gate across the only road in and out of that subdivision and put up a clean white sign with my name on it. That was enough. Funny thing about boundaries. People call you unreasonable the second you start enforcing one they have been ignoring for years. In my case, they had been ignoring it for almost 3 decades. I should explain who I am, because that matters here. My name is Walter Marsh, and I spent 38 years working as a land surveyor. That kind of work teaches you something most people never really absorb. Land does not care about feelings. Property law does not bend because someone is frustrated, or because a lot of people got used to something being convenient. A deed says what it says. A recorded agreement exists or it does not. Everything else is just noise people make when reality stops lining up with what they want. I had spent most of my adult life untangling bad assumptions, sloppy records, and expensive misunderstandings. So when something felt off on my own land, I knew better than to ignore it. My father died in 2021. And when the ranch passed to me, I did what I had always done when ownership changed or a question started bothering me. I went to the records, and then I went to the land itself. The ranch was 340 acres, same family land since 1951. We were not running it the way we had in the old days, not with cattle at the same scale, but it was still a living ranch. A week after the transfer recorded, I decided to walk the boundaries for the first time in years. That was when I reached the bridge over Sutter Creek and stopped. It was an old concrete bridge, built by my father in 1967. 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, weathered, but still solid. There was rust on the rails and cracking near some of the joints, but nothing unusual for its age. The bridge itself was not what troubled me. What troubled me was what sat on the other side of it. Beyond that crossing was Crestwood Meadows, a subdivision built in the mid-1990s. Every resident there used that bridge. Every delivery truck crossed it. Every school bus crossed it. It was, for all practical purposes, the neighborhood's only real vehicle access. Standing there, looking at traffic roll over a structure my father had poured on our land, I had one question I could not shake. What exactly gave that subdivision the legal right to use my father's bridge? I could not remember ever seeing an easement for it, and that bothered me immediately. Memory is not evidence, so I didn't let myself rely on instinct. I walked back to the ranch house, opened my father's filing cabinet, and found a folder labeled Bridge, Sutter Creek, 1967. Inside were construction invoices, an old hand-drawn sketch, and a parcel description. The bridge sat entirely on our property. Both ends of it, the full span, the western approach, all of it. There was no recorded easement in that file, no right-of-way agreement, no access license, nothing. Most people, I think, would have shrugged and told themselves that if the neighborhood had been using it forever, then it must be fine. I am not built that way. If the paperwork is missing, the answer is not to pretend that is comforting. So I called Margaret Solis, a property attorney who had handled some estate work for my father. I told her I wanted the full title history and every record tied to that crossing. 4 days later, she told me to come in and bring every folder I had. When I walked into her office that Monday, she already had county records spread across the conference table. The deed history matched what I had found at home. The bridge had always been private property. No recorded public right had ever existed for the subdivision, the county, or the HOA. Yet the subdivision plat from 1994 showed that bridge as the main entrance, as if the developer had simply assumed it belonged there. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a clerical mistake and started seeing it for what it really was, a gamble. Somewhere back in the 1990s, a developer had built an entire neighborhood around a bridge he didn't own, sold 140 lots, and walked away. Even then, I wanted to remove every possible argument before anyone said I was misreading something. So I commissioned a fresh survey. We ran the boundaries, located the bridge, checked the approaches, and filed the plat. Same answer. Every inch of that bridge sat on my land.
Margaret looked at me and said they'd probably argue prescriptive easement. In simple terms, that meant the HOA would try to claim long, open, uninterrupted use and eventually become a legal right. I understood why that would be their best argument. 28 years of daily traffic sounds powerful when you say it out loud. But in property law, long use by itself is not magic. It has to begin and continue in a way the law recognizes. And that is when another folder changed everything. I found it on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked inside a box of old correspondence, developer letters from 1993 to 1995. One letter in particular was dated June 14, 1994. It was on my father's letterhead, addressed to the developer's project manager. I remember the sound that old paper made when I unfolded it, and I remember reading it twice because I knew right away how important it was. In that letter, my father granted temporary construction access over the bridge. Temporary. He called it a personal accommodation. Then he stated in plain, unmistakable language that the permission did not create an easement, did not grant permanent access, and any future residential access would require a separate recorded instrument. That instrument, as far as the record showed, was never created. So I took that letter straight to Margaret. She read it once, then again more slowly, then leaned back in her chair and said, "Your father just destroyed their case." She was right. A prescriptive easement claim depends on hostile use, and legal hostility doesn't mean angry or rude, it means use without permission. But the entire history of that bridge started with permission. My father had allowed construction traffic in writing while specifically warning that permanent residential use would require a formal recorded agreement later. Since that never happened, the neighborhood's use never had the clean legal starting point it needed to evolve into a prescriptive right. In other words, what they had was not a right. It was decades of people acting like unfinished business had somehow become permanent just because no one forced the issue. Then, Margaret pulled county maintenance records, and that was where this stopped being sloppy and started feeling shameless. The HOA had contacted the county road department in 2003, 2011, and 2019, asking for bridge repairs. Every single time, the county wrote back with the same answer. It was not a county bridge, it was not public, and it was a private structure with a private owner. That meant the HOA had been told in writing 3 separate times that the bridge was private property, and still they kept using it like it was theirs. That told me something ugly but important. Sometimes people don't ignore a legal problem because they don't understand it. Sometimes they ignore it because solving it would cost money and pretending is cheaper. Margaret sent a demand letter. It was 12 pages long. It laid out the ownership history, the lack of any recorded easement, the construction access letter from my father, and the county's repeated written warnings. It demanded that the HOA acknowledge my ownership, stop unauthorized use, and either negotiate a recorded easement with maintenance terms or prepare for me to gate the bridge and let the courts decide the rest. The HOA president at the time, Diane Crowley, decided to gamble. Their lawyer filed a prescriptive easement claim anyway. On paper, I will admit, it was the only argument they had. They tried to separate the subdivision's long-term residential use from the developer's earlier temporary construction permission. It was clever in the way bad legal arguments sometimes are. It sounded plausible if you skimmed it. The problem was that the documents didn't support it. The situation started to turn inside the neighborhood before the hearing even happened. At one board meeting, Paul Henning stood up and asked why nobody had investigated the county's 2003 letter when it clearly said the bridge was private property. According to people who were there, you could feel the room shift when he said that. Up until then, I had been the villain in their story. I was the stubborn landowner, the unreasonable rancher, the man threatening to trap a neighborhood behind a gate. But once residents realized their own board had been warned multiple times and done nothing, some of them started understanding that the real problem wasn't me. The real problem was years of HOA leadership treating convenience like ownership. The case landed in front of Judge Alma Reyes, and that mattered more than the HOA probably realized. Before law school, she had worked as a title examiner, which meant she read land documents like good surveyors do, precisely, instinctively, and with no patience for people improvising around bad records. At the hearing, the HOA's lawyer tried to press that same argument, saying the residents' daily use after construction was somehow separate from the developer's temporary construction permission. But the judge kept coming back to the same question. If the use became hostile later, when exactly did that happen? What date started the legal clock? They never had a clean answer because there wasn't one. There was no letter revoking permission and announcing a new claim, no formal assertion of right, no identifiable turning point, just years of people continuing to cross because no one had forced them to stop. 10 days later, the ruling came in. Summary judgment for me. The prescriptive easement claim was dismissed with prejudice, which meant they couldn't bring that same argument back again. Margaret called me from the courthouse parking lot and said, very calmly, "Walter, you won. Lock the gate." So, that afternoon, I drove down to the bridge. The creek below was cold and running light. I swung the steel.
A few minutes later, a car came up from the subdivision side, stopped at the bridge, and just sat there. Then it backed away. I will be honest, that was satisfying. Not because I enjoyed making ordinary people miserable. I did not. Most of them had bought homes assuming somebody had handled the legal work years ago. But I would also be lying if I said there was not something deeply satisfying about finally ending the fog of denial. No more vague language. No more "we've always used it." No more pretending that paperwork does not matter just because everybody got used to ignoring it. That night, the HOA held an emergency meeting, and by all accounts, it was chaos. Residents were furious. The detour added 36 minutes a day for some of them. School routes were disrupted. Deliveries had to be redirected. Board members who had treated me like a nuisance suddenly started speaking in that panicked tone people use when denial runs out and consequences show up. Their lawyer told them what Margaret had already told me. The case was over. There was no secret legal trick left, no appeal with real odds, no magic fix. Only one path remained: negotiate. And that was what I had wanted from the beginning. I never wanted to punish 140 families forever. What bothered me most was how easily an entire community can build its daily life on paperwork that was supposed to exist but never did. People move in, they raise children, they plant gardens, they refinance homes, they wave to neighbors and settle into routines. And all the while, there can be a giant legal hole sitting underneath the most ordinary part of their day. That was the real lesson for me. Never confuse routine with legitimacy. Just because something has been happening for years does not mean it was ever legally right. Time can normalize almost anything, including somebody else's trespass. Once the board finally came back ready to act like adults, I gave them exactly what my father had anticipated back in 1994. Terms in writing, a permanent recorded easement, a maintenance covenant, structural inspection requirements, reserve funding for repairs, a settlement payment, and one line Margaret insisted we include because she wanted every future board member to read it and understand exactly what had happened. Their right to cross that bridge came from the recorded instrument, not from prior use, not from prescription, and not from wishful thinking. It came from the law. They signed in January. The next morning, before sunrise, I drove back to the bridge, took off the padlock, swung the gate open, and stood there in the cold while the first commuter from Crestwood Meadows rolled across. Headlights swept over the concrete deck my father had poured in 1967. Tires hummed over a crossing that finally had the legal paperwork it should have had all along. And that felt good in a different way. By then, it was not just about winning. It was about making the record match the truth. My father had built that bridge for ranch work. A developer later tried to turn it into a subdivision infrastructure without completing the one step that actually mattered. My father had seen the risk, put the warning in writing, and filed the letter where it could one day be found. Nearly 30 years later, that single piece of paper did what all the noise, entitlement, and assumptions could not do. It forced everyone back to reality. So yes, the gate went up on a Thursday. But in the end, that gate did more than block a road. It forced a neighborhood, an HOA, and a courtroom to answer one very simple question: Who gets to act like they own something when they never bothered to secure the legal right to use it? That, in the end, was the whole issue. Not emotion, not convenience, not outrage, just ownership, records, and the truth.